Hello, welcome back. I'm Lipton and this is my guest Matthew Lesh. So Matthew, we ended the last conversation by talking about wealth creation and colonialism. So colonies were not crucial to growth in the West. There this distinguished economist. I really admire him. His name is Ron Back. He's from Europe and he penned a study some time ago saying that the value added component of the plantation complex was 11% of British GDP. That's a small number, but still significant. And some people have been invoking this argument to indicate that slavery somehow benefited the UK. And they have responded by saying that the operative term is value added. The value added component of the plantation complex was dependent on the human capital of Europeans because in the West Indies, products were made and then they were exported and refined in the metropole. So the UK, before acquiring slaves, had a productivity revolution, minor growth rates, and the human capital of the population was improving. So the human capital was able to respond to the plantation complex. There are countries with booming industries, but they're still poor because the quality of the human capital is deficient and worker productivity is low. So had it not been for the quality of the labor force in the UK, there would not have been a sufficient response to the plantation economy in the British West Indies.
So I think there's probably a few key points here. First one is to, I suppose, reemphasize the point that, and there is a good moral point here, which is that slavery was reprehensible and the slave trade was revolting, and it is absolutely immoral in a true sense of that word. The second point here is slavery probably did make some people rich. So
Of course.
if you were a slave trader or you owned a farm and had slave workers, or et cetera, you may have very well have gotten rich out of that at an individual level. I think the essential question for kind of economic history here is, was slavery economically the reason why the rich countries are rich today and poor countries are poor? And I think the basic answer to that is no, not really, for the reasons you've kind of been getting at there. Adam Smith actually was, the world's first economist, social scientist. He made this argument viciously against slavery from an economic perspective because he made the point that slaves are not very productive workers, and the cost of slaves is actually quite high in terms of literally having to go kidnap people, put them to work. But they're not going to be particularly hardworking, so you've got to put a lot of work in to basically treat them awfully. And therefore, slaves are not the most productive workers. But I think there's probably another point here, which the likes of Eugene McCloskey make quite effectively, which is the reason why we became rich is because we were innovative and entrepreneurial. And that effectively means the increased use of machinery rather than physical labor. So you can do some comparisons here between what is the richer and poorer part of America. Is it the slave states or the non-slave states? And the answer is the slave states are still poorer today as a result of the fact that they were slave states, than the kind of northern states which didn't have slaves. And that's because the northern states industrialized and they developed and innovated in a way that the southern states that were basically held back by slavery. So not only, I think the point here, and this point goes back to Adam Smith, is not only is slavery kind of morally reprehensible and wrong, but it is also not economically beneficial. It kind of hurts you economically. There's probably another point here to made as well, which is it's not like the only countries in the world that had slaves were now developed countries. Slavery was pretty much a human universal up into recent history, and it was the kind of anti-slave movement, really to some extent, beginning in the UK, which pushed back against this, which pushed back and as kind of like a moral campaign, managed to petition Parliament to ban slavery in the British Empire, to ban the slave trade, and even send ships to Africa to try to disrupt the slave trade. So and mind you, the slave trade happened within Africa, happened between Africa and the Middle East. It was kind of like a standard part of the way the world operated, was the fact that there were these slaves, and the kind of moral push against slaves, I think, is important and essential. And I think one of the great human moral developments of the last few hundred years is the fact that we don't have slaves anymore. I think there's also been positive economically, because it's not the slaves that are going to make you rich. It's your capacity to innovate and create and technologically develop.
The British not only suppressed the slave trade, but there are examples of British officials paying what I would call petty leaders money to prevent them from engaging in human sacrifice. So,
Yeah, I mean, this is some of the argument made around the British Empire in India, which is there were a whole lot of archaic practices that the empire pushed back, that the British Raj pushed back against, in terms of human sacrifice being one example thereof as well. I mean, these kind of arguments about empire are very complex and difficult, because the empire also did do a lot of the British Empire also did a lot of terrible things. I mean, it's hard to have a balanced conversation these days, though, because the assumption here is everything that went on in the British Empire was terrible and awful, and there's nothing good to it. And that is the starting premise for any discussion. Obviously, there obviously was a lot of that, and a lot of that is true. That also needs to be considered against any kind of good or developmental purpose, or any institutions that were created, or whatever, all the efforts that were made by Britain to stop slavery. These things are all need to be assessed in the whole. I mean, Niall Ferguson does an effort at this in his book Empire, kind of going through the history of empire and the British Empire, and trying to figure out what were the good parts and what were the bad parts, and being honest about that, rather than just saying very simplistically everything was bad.
Repeat the name of that person again. Neil Ferguson.
Yeah, Neil Ferguson, the Scottish historian. Yeah.
And no, well, Nigel Biggar is an older person, but he's a theologian. He's writing on colonialism now. I read his latest book, The British Empire Moral Reckoning.
Yes. So he kind of goes through a similar process. Yes, I have. And I think it's also another interesting read, where he's trying to figure out, a more complex moral story about empire. I mean, and it's worth saying that at the time of empire, everyone just thought empire was great, justified, and moral, often for the wrong reasons, which is the sense of kind of a British superiority over the rest of the world, which in retrospect makes no kind of sense whatsoever, and is highly illiberal and wrong. But at the same time, I come from Australia, and I think Australia, the fact that it was colonized by the British as opposed to colonized by another European country is probably good. It created a whole bunch of very positive institutions that enabled Australia to prosper even more so than Britain in the end, at least today. So, it is a complex story. At the same time, Australian colonialism did involve dispossession of Indigenous Australians, and various efforts over the years to try to address that have often made the situation worse, and a lot of that hangs around until today. So you've got to make, again, it's a more complex story, I think, historical story, than is often made out to be.
European colonialism had a civilizing mission. Today it's not fashionable to speak about the civilizing mission, but a major difference between European colonialism and non-European colonialism is that Europeans wanted to create societies that were similar to Europe outside of Europe. So if you were colonized by today, there are revisionist historians who are praising the Mongols. They say that the Mongols weren't too bad on women's issues and they promoted global trade. But the truth is that if you were colonized by the Mongols, you wouldn't be here today having this conversation. The Mongols were not intellectuals. They basically assimilated into the culture of the people that they conquered and really built institutions. So colonialism is a fact in history. It was global. And we're speaking in retrospect, but if you have a choice, you're not going to choose the Mongols.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly complexities here. So there's different. The Belgians, for example, you're probably not going to want them to colonialize you if you're. They were at times particularly brutal in their methods and approach. So I think you're right that there's a lot more nuance to this in terms of the kind of like institutions that were built in different places and different times, and the kind of economic social outcomes. And then a lot of the blame. I mean, what the other issue here as well is there's a lot of blame today put on former colonizers for the state of certain countries, but we are in a post-colonial era. The empire is gone. The capacity of certain countries to be prosperous is now up to them, and they've been self-governed. A lot of the countries that people focus on have now been self-governed for a long time, and to the extent to which they're struggling, some of that can be linked back to colonialism, but a lot of it is that you can link back to more recent policy decisions by governments and very incompetent governments in certain places. So it doesn't really make much sense to blame something that doesn't exist anymore for the situation today.
Botswana was colonized, but Botswana did not go left. There was never a leftward lurch in Botswana.
As opposed to a lot of other places that
exactly
in the post-colonial era chose to align, India being a classic example here of a country with so much potential, but chose to align itself post independence with a quite socialistic economic model that has not served it well. And it has subsequently reformed and become more market driven and become more successful as a result. But that maybe the answer for that is it is the fault of colonialism, because British universities taught the Indian leadership terrible socialist ideas that then they went and implemented in India with not much success. But I mean, it's the question of prosperity today. I think there's a lot more to do with the decisions made in the post-colonial era and the kind of governments that different places have had far more effect. You can kind of find historical reasons for whatever kind of situation, but it seems silly to me to blame a historical case rather than more recent decisions.
And last point on colonialism, I have read it and it's a good book. Bruce Gilley, he wrote a book in defense of German colonialism.
I'm not an area of expertise of mine.
No, I'm not asking you about German colonialism. I said Bruce Gilley wrote a book. That's a title, In Defense of German Colonialism.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Bruce Gilley is an interesting guy. He had a second book out. I haven't read the second one, The Case for Colonialism.
Worth if people are interested in a bit.
Look
it up.
Bruce Gilley is like a modern David Fieldhouse, but really blunt.
I see the subtitle, In Defense of German Colonialism, and how its critics empowered Nazis, communists, and the enemies of the West.
Yeah. Like I read the online version, so I was planning to buy it, but I was online and I saw the ebook and I downloaded it and I read it. So these days I'm not buying books. I'm just finding ebooks everywhere and I just read them.
Or audiobooks is my other favorite.
Yeah, yes. But yeah, Bruce Gilley is an interesting guy. He's a fascinating take on colonialism and empires. But before we go, last question, Matthew. Name a regulation that you would gut if you were the PM of England.
I mean, it's a very, very simple answer, which is the Town and Country Planning Act, which I think is talking of that post-war era, was this piece of legislation that was created in the late 1940s in the UK, which has held back housing development and has led to so many of the current issues the UK faces in terms of its productivity and quality of life. And I think we feel that every day in the UK, every time we pay rent or our mortgages, we feel the consequences of that piece of legislation.
Okay. All right. So speaking to you has been a pleasure. I am not far from England. I'm in Europe. So I can go to the IEA at some point.
Most welcome. Most welcome to
your address is online. Just tell me the people who will be there so I know who to contact. All right. So bye, Matthew.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks. Bye.